woman in her 70s, a cheap suitcase, and 2 smirking airline workers. No one expected the twist that would turn humiliation into national headlines. A quiet afternoon at the airport. It was one of those still, golden afternoons where the sunlight seemed to pause in mid-air, filtering through the towering glass walls of the terminal and painting long honeyed streaks across the marble floor. The airport bustled with the usual rhythm of daily travel, children tugging on tired parents, suitcases rumbling over tile, the distant echo of rolling intercom announcements, naming flights and gates, barely distinguishable from one another. Air smelled faintly of roasted coffee and recycled air. A jazz melody, barely audible, leaked from a nearby cafe's speakers and mixed with the low hum of voices, shoes, and motion. No one noticed her at first. An elderly black woman, likely in her late 70s, stepped slowly through the sliding doors near the entrance. Her figure was slightly stooped, but there was a kind of grace in the way she moved, and hurried, deliberate. She wore a pale blue blouse buttoned to the collar and a well-pressed ankle-length grey skirt. The heels of her polished shoes tapped softly against the floor as she walked, steadying herself with a dark wooden cane. In her other hand, she pulled a modest rolling suitcase, its fabric slightly faded, the zipper edges frayed from time. Her name was Miss Eleanor Grant, though only a few people in the terminal knew or would ever know that name. She didn't walk with the air of someone important. She didn't look around for attention. Instead, she kept her eyes focused ahead, her expression neutral, almost serene. Her dark brown skin, weathered from years of sun and work, glowed faintly in the afternoon light. Deep smile lines framed her cheeks and mouth, traces of a life filled with stories, laughter, and perhaps just as many heartbreaks. Her hair was neatly braided, silver strands woven among the black like threads of wisdom. Her eyes, warm, tired, but kind, moved carefully across the signs overhead, scanning slowly, perhaps double-checking the terminal number. She paused for a moment, allowing a group of younger travelers to rush by her with earbuds in and eyes glued to their phones. None of them made eye contact, but Eleanor didn't seem to mind. She wasn't in a rush. She never had been. She continued walking, each step a gentle negotiation between strength and gravity. It was a long way from the parking drop-off to the check-in counter, but she didn't ask for assistance. There was something in her bearing that suggested she'd spent a lifetime carrying her own weight quietly, patiently, without complaint. As she approached the check-in area, she paused again, setting her suitcase upright and letting out a soft breath. A few beads of sweat clung to her forehead. Though the terminal's air conditioning was cool, she looked around briefly, as if searching for the correct counter. A nearby family darted past her, brushing her shoulder slightly without an apology. A mother tugged her toddler along as he pointed at the elderly woman, loudly asking why she had a stick to walk. The mother hushed him and turned away. Still, Miss Eleanor smiled faintly, not offended, just used to being misunderstood. Her eyes found the airline kiosk. She resumed her slow march toward it, weaving carefully between the lines of passengers. Around her, people grumbled about delays, stood staring at their phones, adjusted designer crayons. A couple argued about overhead bin space. A businessman cursed under his breath after spilling his coffee. And in the middle of it all, Miss Eleanor moved like a whisper, present but barely noticed. She reached the check-in counter. 2 airline staff members stood chatting behind the desk. One of them, a young man with sleek hair and a silver name tag, glanced at her as she approached, then quickly returned to his phone. The other, a young woman chewing gum, sighed, as if annoyed at the interruption. Eleanor stood patiently, ticket in hand, suitcase beside her. The line behind her began to grow, but she didn't seem to notice. She was focused only on making sure her flight to Birmingham would be on time. She hadn't flown in years, but this trip mattered more than any before it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held out her paper ticket. The airline agent barely looked up. And so, the golden afternoon continued, indifferent. In a sea of people, Miss Eleanor stood alone, wrapped in the quiet dignity of someone who knew how to wait, how to endure, and how to move through the world without needing to shout to be heard. Not yet, anyway. Miss Eleanor stood at the check-in counter, her paper ticket slightly crumpled at the edges from being held tightly in her hand. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from age and effort. She cleared her throat gently, trying to catch the attention of the 2 airline agents behind the counter. The young man glanced up first, He looked to be in his mid-twenties, sharp haircut, crisply ironed uniform shirt, and a half-drunk iced coffee sitting beside the keyboard. He raised one eyebrow at her before nudging the girl next to him with his elbow. She followed his gaze, looked Eleanor up and down with casual disinterest, and let out a soft, theatrical sigh. "Oh boy," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for her colleague and, unfortunately, Eleanor to hear. These people never know how to use online check-in. The two exchanged smirks, barely masking their amusement. The woman adjusted her headset, leaned forward on the counter, and said with syrupy slowness, "Can I help you, ma'am?" Miss Eleanor, ever composed, nodded politely. "Yes, dear. I'm afraid I don't quite know how to check in with the machines over there. I printed my ticket, but I'm not sure what to do next. Would you be so kind as to help me?" Her voice was soft but clear, warm with southern gentleness. She held out her boarding pass with both hands, as though offering something delicate. The young man took it without looking her in the eye, tapping a few keys as he glanced at the screen. "You don't have a digital boarding pass?" he asked, almost mockingly. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No, sir. I don't own one of those fancy phones. Just this little flip one." She pulled it gently from her handbag, a small, scratched-up phone with a screen barely big enough to show a single line of text. The woman stifled a laugh. "Not very well." "Oh wow," she whispered, turning back toward her colleague. "A flip phone? That's ancient history." She rolled her eyes and added under her breath, "It's 2025, for God's sake." Eleanor's hands rested lightly on the edge of the counter, her cane tucked beneath her arm. She didn't frown. She didn't correct them. She simply smiled, that same weary but dignified smile that had carried her through decades of life, far tougher than the sneers of two unkind strangers. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I'm not very good with all this new technology. I try my best, but it all changes so quickly these days." The man printed something from the computer and shoved a fresh boarding pass across the counter toward her. "Next time, just use the kiosk, or get someone to show you how to do it online," he said. His tone clipped. The woman leaned in again, using that same falsely sweet tone. "We just recommend that passengers try to stay updated. It helps everyone move faster. You know." A line was forming behind Miss Eleanor, a few impatient sighs audible from those waiting. One man in a business suit checked his watch loudly, muttering something about being late for a meeting. A young couple with matching backpacks whispered to each other in Spanish, glancing curiously at the scene. One woman, a mother with a toddler on her hip, stood, two people behind, and watched the exchange with a furrowed brow. Her lips parted, as if she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she looked down at her child and bounced him gently. Silent. Miss Eleanor, still smiling, reached for the boarding pass with a slow hand. "Thank you very much," she said. "I'm flying to Birmingham today. Haven't flown in a long time." "Oh, okay," the young man said blandly. "Gate 12. Just follow the signs." He was already turning to the next person in line, as Miss Eleanor turned away, her suitcase bumping softly behind her. The woman at the counter leaned closer to her colleague and whispered, "You'd think they'd know how to travel by now." The man chuckled under his breath, but Eleanor didn't turn back. She didn't flinch. She had heard every word, but chose silence over conflict. She had seen worse, lived through worse. In her day, people didn't just talk down to you, they talked through you, as if you weren't there, and yet, she had endured, gracefully. She walked away, slow but steady, past the sea of indifferent faces, her eyes fixed on the distant signs overhead. Gates 10 to 20 gives. As she passed, the mother from earlier watched her go, her expression unreadable. The child on her hip giggled and waved at Eleanor as she walked by. Miss Eleanor paused and smiled at the child, giving a small wave in return. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she adjusted her cane and resumed her quiet walk to the gate. The terminal noise swallowed her footsteps. Behind her, the world moved on, unchanged. But something, though no one could quite name it, was shifting. Miss Eleanor made her way down the long stretch of corridor toward gate 12, her cane tapping softly against the floor with each step. The handle of her suitcase brushed against her heel now and then, but she didn't seem to mind. She walked with quiet resolve, even as the sting of humiliation lingered in her chest like an echo. The words from the check-in counter, "These people never know how to use online check-in, and you'd think they'd know how to travel by now," still swirled in her ears. Not loudly, not angrily, but like a dull ache, familiar, but always painful. By the time she reached the gate, she was winded. She found an empty seat near the wide windows, away from the crowd, and lowered herself onto the bench with great care. Her knees protested quietly, and she let out a faint sigh as she placed her cane beside her. Outside the window, a plane taxied slowly toward the runway, its silver wings gleaming in the afternoon sun. She watched it absent-mindedly, her eyes glassy. Her back remained straight, her shoulders squared, but her expression had softened. Her mouth no longer held its quiet smile. Her lips pressed together tightly, and her eyes, those kind, tired eyes, were now moist, blinking slowly as if to hold something back. She didn't cry. Miss Eleanor never cried in public, but there it was, the weight of being unseen, unheard, and disrespected. Not for the first time, probably not the last. The terminal bustled around her, unaware. Gate announcements hummed overhead, children laughed, phones rang. A young woman sat 2 seats away snapping selfies. Another man munched loudly on chips, headphones in, oblivious. No one noticed her, not really until he did. A man in a tailored grey suit, walking briskly with a leather briefcase tucked under one arm, came striding past. His gait was confident, purposeful, the kind of walk that made people move out of his way instinctively. He was tall, clean-shaven, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. As he passed the row of seats near the window, his eyes fell on Miss Eleanor and he stopped. Just for a second he blinked once, then twice. Something in her posture, or perhaps her face, stirred a memory deep within him. He stepped backward slowly, as though retracing time itself. He looked again, more closely this time, and then without hesitation, he changed course, walking directly toward her. There was a sudden shift in the air, subtle but sharp. Miss Eleanor looked up, surprised at first. The man stopped in front of her, lowered his briefcase to the floor, and without a word, knelt down on one knee, not out of necessity, but out of respect. Glint of recognition passed between them like sunlight slipping through a curtain. Miss Eleanor's lips curled into a small, trembling smile. "Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's face lit up with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice catching slightly in his throat. "It's me, Jonathan Miles." Miss Eleanor shook her head in gentle wonder. "My lord, look at you. A man now." He laughed softly, emotion rising in his throat. "A man, because of you." By now, the nearby passengers had begun to notice. Whispers floated through the air like feathers in a breeze. "Is that wait? I think that's Senator Jonathan Miles. Oh my God, it is. That's him." Phones lowered. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned to the quiet scene unfolding near Gate 12, where a U.S. senator knelt before an elderly black woman like a child, reuniting with a beloved grandmother. The woman taking selfies to seats over had stopped mid-purse. The man eating chips set his bag down without realizing it. A teenager snapped a photo, stunned. But the senator wasn't performing. He wasn't aware of the eyes on him. All his focus was on the woman in front of him, the one who had once stood at the front of a dusty Alabama classroom in a skirt suit and chalk-stained fingers, teaching multiplication tables to children who no one else believed in. He took Miss Eleanor's hand in both of his. "I can't believe it's really you. Miss Grant, you changed my life." Eleanor smiled softly. "You were always a bright one. You just needed someone to tell you so." The senator glanced around the terminal, eyes now sharp with something else. Pride, yes, but also anger. He had walked into the airport moments ago, surrounded by aides and reporters, but none of them mattered now. He rose slowly, turning toward the growing crowd. "Do you know who this woman is?" he said, raising his voice just enough. "This woman taught me how to read, how to think, how to believe I was worth something." He turned to Eleanor again, voice low. "I owe you everything." Gasps whispered through the rows of seats. One woman covered her mouth. A man placed his hand over his heart. Eleanor looked down, blinking quickly, clearly overwhelmed. "You didn't have to say all that, Jonathan," she murmured, her voice thick. "But I did," he said, eyes wet. He reached for her suitcase. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me walk you to your gate." Senator Jonathan Miles didn't ask permission. He simply picked up Miss Eleanor's suitcase with one hand and offered her the other. She took it gently, her fingers resting in the crook of his elbow as they began to walk together. Gate 12 wasn't far, But in that moment, it felt like a procession. A quiet crowd followed behind, some from curiosity, others from reverence. Phones stayed lowered. For once, no one reached for a selfie or a viral clip. They simply watched. Senator Miles walked at Eleanor's pace, slow, deliberate, respectful. Her cane tapped rhythmically beside them, and with each step, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted further. The idle buzz of travel dulled to a hush. Even the overhead announcements seemed to soften their tone. The senator's voice rose just enough to carry to those nearby. He wasn't grandstanding. He was remembering. "This woman," he said, nodding toward Eleanor, "was my first real teacher, not just in school, but in life." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I grew up in rural Alabama," he continued, "back when kids like me, poor, scared, father gone, didn't have much of a chance. Schools were still unofficially segregated. Resources were ... non-existent." He paused, eyes flicking to Miss Eleanor's face, then back to the crowd. "Our schoolhouse was falling apart. The roof leaked when it rained. We didn't have heating in the winter. Sometimes, we didn't even have chairs. There were no computers, no whiteboards, and most of the time no textbooks." Several passengers gasped softly, but Miss Eleanor was there. Every single day, before the sun rose, after the sun set, she taught 4 different grades at once, in one room. She made flashcards by hand. She taught us math using pebbles, and history with nothing more than her memory and a chalkboard. A quiet awe fell over the group, trailing them. She bought pencils with her own money, he added. Paper too when she could afford it. Sometimes, she didn't eat lunch, so we could. Miss Eleanor's eyes were misty again. She tried to shake her head gently, embarrassed by the attention, but the senator pressed on, his voice growing thicker with emotion. She didn't just teach black kids. She taught anyone who walked through the door, black, white, Latino, and she treated us all with dignity, even when the rest of the world didn't. They neared the waiting area for Gate 12, where passengers had stopped pretending to scroll their phones and now sat openly watching. A TSA agent stepped aside without being asked, recognizing the senator but staying respectfully silent. "Jonathan." Miles slowed and turned toward the gathering crowd, now nearly a full semicircle behind them. "I wouldn't be here without her," he said simply. "Not just in this airport, I mean here." He tapped his chest. Alive, educated, driven. Standing in the US Senate, he looked at the faces staring back, business travelers, airport employees, families, students. He let the moment breathe. "She gave me the kind of belief that doesn't fade, and she never asked for recognition, never asked for a dime." A hush of reverence followed his words. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffled. Miss Eleanor stood beside him, chin lifted just slightly, not proud in the way of someone expecting praise but in the quiet way of someone who knew the value of a life spent giving. Then, from behind the group, movement, the 2 young airline staffers from the check-in counter still in uniform, still holding their tablets, stood frozen halfway into the gate area. Their smirks were gone. The woman's gum-chewing had stopped. The young man's posture was rigid, his eyes darting between the senator and Miss Eleanor. They were pale with realization and shame. The senator saw them and nodded once in their direction, not with anger but as if to say, "This is why we listen. This is why we don't judge what we don't understand." Miss Eleanor looked at them, her expression unreadable. No gloating, no bitterness, just the same soft grace that had carried her through decades of silent service. A little girl near the front of the group looked up at her mother. "Mama," she whispered, "is she famous?" The mother bent down and replied quietly, "No, baby, she's important." Eleanor smiled at that. Senator Miles leaned down, his voice quiet now. "Can I sit with you until they board?" "I'd like that," she whispered. They sat side by side, not speaking for a while. No one approached them, not out of fear, but out of respect, as if something sacred had unfolded among the boarding passes and rolling suitcases. The sun shifted again, casting long shadows across the floor. The golden light fell on Miss Eleanor's face, illuminating her like a stained glass window, and in that moment, it was clear her dignity didn't come from fame or wealth, or titles. It came from impact, from lives changed in silence, from children who became senators, and from being a light steadfast and quiet in the darkest of times. A soft chime sounded overhead. The final boarding call for Flight 228 to Washington, D.C., MIS's Eleanor stirred gently beside Senator Miles, glancing at the gate screen. Her hands folded neatly on her lap, her cane resting against the chair. Was ready, but before she could rise, a young woman in airline uniform approached cautiously. It was the same employee from the check-in counter, the one who had sighed and muttered under her breath earlier. But now, she looked nothing like the smug girl from before. Her posture was low. Her eyes didn't carry arrogance, only regret. "Ma'am," she began, her voice a touch shaky. "Miss Eleanor, I just wanted to say I'm truly sorry for how I treated you earlier. It was wrong. It was disrespectful. And it won't happen again." Behind her, the young man followed closely, nodding quickly. "We didn't know who you were, but that's not the point. We should have treated you with dignity regardless." The words hung in the air, fragile and sincere. Miss Eleanor looked up at them quietly, her gaze firm but kind. She took a breath and nodded. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "I accept your apology." The young woman blinked quickly, relieved, but Eleanor wasn't done. She continued, her voice still calm. "Next time someone seems slow or unsure, try kindness first. Not everyone is lost. Some of us have just walked a much longer road." The young woman swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." A moment later, a senior airline manager arrived at Eleanor's side, holding a new boarding pass. He looked freshly briefed, his tie slightly loosened, but his demeanor was crisp. "Miss Eleanor Grant," he said respectfully, "on behalf of Horizon Air, we'd like to offer you a complimentary upgrade to first class, not as a favor, but in recognition of who you are and what you've done." She hesitated at first, fingers brushing over the worn paper of her original boarding pass. "That's very kind, but I'm just fine back where I was." But Senator Miles leaned in. "Please take it," he said with a smile. "You deserve at least that much." She smiled at him, nodding once. With her new ticket in hand, the airline staff guided her toward the boarding lane. Jonathan walked alongside her, carrying her suitcase as if it were priceless cargo. Just before she stepped onto the jet bridge, he stopped her gently. "Miss Eleanor." She turned, and he took her hand, weathered, small, strong hand, kissed it softly, eyes never leaving hers. "You changed the world," he said simply. A pause, and then, with that same quiet smile she had given countless children over the years, she whispered, "I just tried to show you that you could." He stepped back, and the terminal seemed to stand still as she walked toward the plane. But she wasn't the same woman who'd been laughed at an hour ago. She wasn't a burden, a confusion, a tech-illiterate nuisance. Now, she was seen as the gate attendant scanned her upgraded boarding pass and offered a quiet thank you. Miss Eleanor stepped into the first-class cabin. A flight attendant guided her gently to her seat row, 1A, offering her juice and asking if she'd like help storing her bag. A fresh blanket was placed on her lap. Another attendant addressed her as Miss Grant with warm respect. She sat quietly, looking out the window as the sun dipped lower, throwing amber light across the tarmac. Her reflection in the glass shimmered, wrinkled, yes, but proud. Whole scene. Back in the terminal, Senator Miles stood watching, hands in his pockets. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. This moment didn't belong to the cameras or the crowd. It belonged to her, a woman who had once stood in a leaky schoolhouse, surrounded by chaos and poverty, and planted seeds anyway without promise of harvest. And now, years later, those seeds were blooming. She had raised doctors, lawyers, parents, teachers, and one senator, not with wealth, not with fame, with chalk, with patience, with belief. As the plane door closed, and the jet rolled gently away from the gate, Eleanor leaned back in her seat. Her hands rested on the blanket, fingers folded softly. She didn't need applause. She didn't need a headline. She had been seen and, more importantly, remembered. Moral lesson: respect isn't earned by title or money. It's earned by the lives we quietly touch. Never underestimate the power of dignity, and never judge someone's worth by how they appear. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes walk among us in silence, carrying not pride but purpose.